What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Dr. Joe Blow at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. Throughout the world, the systematic dispossession of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands has been a tragic and enduring of colonialism in its highest form. From the Americas to Africa and beyond, the seizure of land, resources, and cultural heritage has left deep wounds on indigenous communities worldwide. This dispossession was not random or accidental. It was the result of deliberate policies and legal frameworks designed to justify and facilitate the transfer of wealth and power from indigenous peoples to colonizers and world bankers. By understanding these demonic mechanisms of control, we can better grasp the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights and the urgent need for justice and restitution. This exploration is not merely an academic exercise, it is a call to action. By acknowledging the injustices of the past, we can work towards a future where indigenous peoples are recognized as the rightful stewards of their lands and cultures. The foundation of the world politics and government is based on the Spanish Inquisition, and most of your leadership knows this. The dispossession of indigenous lands was achieved through a multifaceted system of control. This system utilized legal doctrines, religious decrees, and economic policies. The Doctrine of Discovery, a key instrument, emerged in the 15th century. Rooted in papal bulls, it granted European Christian nations the right to claim sovereignty over discovered lands. Non-Christian lands were deemed terra nullius, empty lands, despite indigenous presence. This concept ignored indigenous governance, land tenure, and spiritual beliefs. The Doctrine of Discovery justified European claims to vast territories. It was part of a broader pattern of religious and political authority used to legitimize the seizure of indigenous lands. The Inquisition's persecution of non-Christians led to forced conversions and property confiscation. This persecution became a blueprint for the treatment of indigenous populations in colonized lands. The belief in European superiority created a climate where indigenous rights were routinely violated. Economic policies played a crucial role in dispossessing indigenous peoples of their lands and livelihoods. The dispossession of indigenous lands was often accompanied by a deliberate process of reclassification. This involved stripping indigenous peoples of their identities, cultures, and legal standing. One of the most insidious aspects was constructing indigenous peoples as legally and socially inferior. This reclassification justified their subjugation and the seizure of their lands. By defining indigenous peoples as savages, European powers legitimized their dispossession. Blood quantum laws linked indigenous identity to a specific percentage of Indian blood. These laws divided communities and undermined indigenous sovereignty. The reclassification extended beyond legal definitions, suppressing cultures, languages, and spiritual beliefs. Forced assimilation policies aimed to erase cultural identities. This systematic attack led to the loss of languages, traditional knowledge, and cultural practices. The power of reclassification lay in its ability to dehumanize indigenous peoples. Indigenous communities continue to grapple with the effects of cultural suppression and the ongoing struggle to reclaim their identities. The fight for cultural revitalization and the preservation of indigenous languages is a testament to their resilience. The Spanish Inquisition casts a long shadow on colonialism and its impact on indigenous populations. Established in 1478, it targeted heresy, particularly secret Jews and Muslims. Methods included imprisonment, torture, and public executions. Its influence shaped European colonizers' attitudes towards indigenous populations. The belief in Christianity's superiority justified colonization and exploitation. While the Spanish Inquisition was driven by religious fervor, it also served the political ambitions of the Spanish monarchy. By consolidating religious power, Ferdinand and Isabella sought to unify Spain under a single faith. This intertwining of religious and political authority had profound implications for European interactions with indigenous populations. The Inquisition silenced dissent, eliminated rivals, and confiscated wealth. Those accused of heresy, often from wealthy families, had their property seized. This economic incentive fueled the Inquisition's activities. It became an instrument of both religious and political control. The Inquisition's effectiveness in consolidating power served as a model for other European monarchs. The belief that religious uniformity was essential for political stability drove colonial expansion. European powers imposed their religious and cultural norms on indigenous populations. The quest for golden resources was intertwined with religious justifications. The desire to spread Christianity provided moral legitimacy to the pursuit of wealth and power. Indigenous populations were subjected to forced conversion, enslavement, and displacement. The legacy of the Inquisition's intertwining of religious and political power can be seen in the way European powers used religion to justify their actions in colonized lands. Treaties were often signed under duress, with indigenous leaders forced to cede their territories and convert to Christianity under threat of violence. This pattern of coercion and exploitation, rooted in European superiority, had devastating consequences for indigenous communities, leading to the loss of land, culture, and self-determination. When the Spanish Inquisition reached the Americas, its methods of control became a blueprint for the treatment of indigenous populations. Dehumanization, torture, and property confiscation were tactics used in the colonial project. Conquistadors brought religious and cultural superiority, treating indigenous populations with brutality. Forced conversions and the destruction of sacred sites were common. The legacy of the Inquisition's influence is seen in systemic racism and discrimination today. Before we go any further, let's break down the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is a legal concept primarily from the 15th century, that allowed European nations to claim sovereignty over lands they discovered, meaning lands not previously known to Europeans, even if indigenous peoples were already living there, essentially justifying the colonization of those lands by deeming indigenous populations as not having legitimate claims to their own territory. It is widely criticized for its role in dispossessing indigenous peoples globally. Key points about the Doctrine of Discovery. The doctrine emerged from papal bulls issued by the Catholic Church, notably the Dum Diversas by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, which granted Portuguese monarchs the right to conquer and claim lands inhabited by non-Christians, justification for colonization. We will get more into the papal bulls later. It provided a legal basis for European powers to claim ownership of indigenous lands by asserting that discovery granted them superior rights to the land, even if indigenous peoples were already present. Impact on indigenous peoples. This doctrine was used to justify the dispossession and subjugation of indigenous populations worldwide, as their presence was often disregarded or considered unoccupied by European standards. Criticisms today. The Doctrine of Discovery is widely condemned as a tool of colonialism that undermined indigenous rights and sovereignty, with many indigenous groups calling for its complete repudiation. The Spanish Inquisition's legacy of intolerance and religious justification for violence resonates in today's indigenous struggles. Colonialism's seeds, sown by the Inquisition, have led to systemic racism, economic inequality, and cultural suppression. Forced removal of indigenous populations, justified by discovery or Christianity, mirrors the Inquisition's persecution. The Doctrine of Discovery, rooted in papal bulls, justified European sovereignty over indigenous lands. Indigenous communities challenged this doctrine, seeking recognition of their inherent rights. The fight for land rights and cultural preservation directly challenges colonialism's robbery. The Doctrine of Discovery's impact on indigenous populations stems from 15th century papal bulls. These pronouncements, cloaked in religious language, provided the framework for European sovereignty over indigenous lands. The papal bull, Romanus Pontifex, granted Portugal the right to conquer and enslave non-Christians, legitimizing the transatlantic slave trade. Another significant bull, Inter Caetera, granted Spain dominion over lands west of a line in the Atlantic Ocean. This division of the world between European powers exemplifies the disregard for indigenous sovereignty. The papal bulls played a crucial role in shaping the legal landscape that enabled indigenous dispossession. The Doctrine of Discovery provided European powers with a justification for claiming indigenous lands. Rooted in the belief that European Christian nations had a right to claim discovered lands, it ignored indigenous governance and spiritual beliefs. The concept of terra nullius deemed non-Christian lands vacant and ripe for taking. This legal fiction ignored indigenous connections to their lands and justified their seizure. The doctrine's impact was catastrophic, leading to forced removals, cultural suppression, and loss of traditional ways of life. The legacy of dispossession continues to affect indigenous communities today. Legalizing dispossession refers to a situation where a government or authority uses legal mechanisms to take away someone's property or land, often without proper compensation or due process, essentially making the act of depriving someone of their rightful possession legal through legislation or policy, even if it is considered morally or ethically problematic. This is frequently seen in historical contexts of colonization or land grabs, where indigenous populations were forcibly displaced from their land through legal means. Key points about legalizing dispossession. Power imbalance. This term often highlights how powerful entities exploit legal loopholes to dispossess marginalized groups who may not have the resources to fight back against such actions. Colonialism is a prominent example, where indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their land through legal mechanisms established by colonizing powers. Critics argue that legalizing dispossession violates human rights and principles of justice, even if the process appears legally sound. A government passing a law that allows for the seizure of land from indigenous communities for development projects without their consent or fair compensation. A legal system that permits landlords to evict tenants without adequate notice or due process, leading to displacement. A government using eminent domain to acquire large swathes of land for private development, potentially displacing residents without sufficient compensation. Indigenous peoples have always resisted the doctrine of discovery's legitimacy. Resistance has taken many forms, from armed uprisings to legal challenges and cultural revitalization. Storytelling, song, and ceremony have kept indigenous history alive and maintained a sense of identity. Legal scholars and human rights organizations challenge the doctrine's flaws and its role in perpetuating oppression. Indigenous communities engage in direct action and civil disobedience to assert their rights and protect their territories. Movements like Standing Rock and Idle No More demonstrate indigenous determination to resist encroachment. The struggle against the doctrine of discovery aims to create a just future for indigenous peoples. Unmasking the doctrine and exposing its role in oppression is essential for dismantling harmful frameworks. Recognizing the harm requires a shift in thinking about history, land ownership, and indigenous settler relationships. Reconciliation demands addressing root causes of injustice and valuing indigenous knowledge and cultures. Engaging in difficult conversations and challenging dominant narratives are crucial for justice and equity. By challenging the doctrine and working towards a just future, we can heal past wounds and respect indigenous rights. The Congress of Verona in 1822, under a veil of secrecy, had far-reaching consequences for indigenous peoples. The great powers of Europe sought to suppress liberal and nationalist movements threatening their authority. A secret treaty targeted Latin American independence movements, viewing them as threats to European colonial interests. The treaty pledged to assist Spain in regaining control of its former colonies, disregarding indigenous sovereignty. This renewed European intervention fueled conflict, displacement, and erosion of indigenous rights. The Secret Treaty of Verona exemplifies the callous disregard for indigenous sovereignty in European diplomacy. The Secret Treaty of Verona's focus on colonial dominance included erasing indigenous identities. Reclassification involved legal maneuvers, social engineering, and cultural suppression to undermine indigenous claims. European legal categories replaced traditional governance, dispossessing indigenous communities. Suppression of languages, spiritual practices, and traditional ways of life aimed to assimilate indigenous populations. Missionaries played a key role in converting indigenous peoples and replacing their beliefs with European values. This erasure facilitated land and resource transfer to European powers, leaving a legacy of trauma and dispossession. The secret Treaty of Verona, signed in a European palace, had ripple effects far beyond the immediate concerns of the assembled powers. In the Americas, it fueled resistance movements, inflaming tensions between indigenous communities, newly independent nations, and European powers. The treaty's legacy, a toxic mix of imperial ambition and disregard for indigenous sovereignty, cast a long shadow on international relations. It significantly impacted Latin American independence movements, uniting diverse groups under self-determination. The treaty strengthened the resolve of those fighting for independence, making clear European powers wouldn't relinquish control without a fight. The wars of independence, while successful, left a legacy of instability and resentment shaping Latin America's political landscape. The treaty also impacted US-European relations, fueling suspicions and tensions, contributing to a climate of mistrust and competition. The reclassification of indigenous populations by colonizers had a profound and lasting impact on indigenous communities worldwide. This process left a legacy of trauma, cultural disruption, and social fragmentation. One devastating consequence was the loss of land and traditional ways of life. Indigenous communities were often forced onto reservations, their access to ancestral lands restricted. Forced removal from homelands severed the deep connection with their territories. The suppression of indigenous languages and cultures resulted in the loss of vital knowledge systems. Indigenous children experienced cultural alienation and loss. Intergenerational trauma continues to affect indigenous communities today. Despite this, indigenous communities have shown remarkable resilience. Efforts to revitalize languages and reclaim traditional knowledge are gaining momentum. The ongoing struggle for recognition and self-determination is a testament to their enduring strength. Their stories remind us of the human cost of colonialism and the need for reconciliation and justice. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, marked a turning point in the fight against slavery. However, for indigenous peoples, it represented both hope and continued dispossession. The proclamation opened the door for increased westward expansion, placing indigenous lands in the path of settlement. The drive to secure land and resources in the West often came at the expense of indigenous communities. Treaties, often broken, forced indigenous nations onto reservations, opening land for settlement. The Emancipation Proclamation's impact on indigenous peoples highlights the complexities of history. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 aimed to stabilize the U.S. financial system but had far-reaching consequences for indigenous communities. It consolidated economic power, often at the expense of marginalized groups, including indigenous nations. The Act's focus on economic growth frequently overlooked indigenous needs, contributing to ongoing poverty and underdevelopment. Discriminatory lending practices and land dispossession hindered indigenous entrepreneurs. The Federal Reserve's policies often exacerbated existing inequalities, perpetuating marginalization. The Buck Act of 1940, aimed at taxation on federal properties, eroded indigenous sovereignty, consolidating federal control. It allowed states to tax activities on federal lands, undermining indigenous governance. Indigenous nations had autonomy over their lands, regulating economic activity and generating revenue. The Act enabled states to impose tax codes on indigenous territories without consent. This intrusion limited tribal self-governance, affecting their ability to manage their own affairs. The Buck Act's legacy is diminished sovereignty and increased dependence on federal programs. The fight to restore indigenous sovereignty and reclaim control over land and resources continues. The history of federal policies towards indigenous peoples is a tragic tale of broken treaties, forced removals, and assimilationist policies. The federal government has pursued a relentless campaign to acquire indigenous lands through coercion, deception, and violence. Treaties were often negotiated under duress, legitimizing the seizure of indigenous lands. These treaties forced tribes onto reservations, disrupting their traditional ways of life. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of indigenous people. The Trail of Tears resulted in the deaths of thousands, leaving a lasting scar on indigenous communities. The assault on indigenous lands continued, with policies shifting from removal to assimilation and termination. The Dawes Act of 1887 aimed to break up communally held lands, forcing Indigenous peoples to adopt European-style agriculture. This policy resulted in the loss of millions of acres of Indigenous lands, further impoverishing communities. The mid-20th century Termination policy sought to dissolve tribal governments, leading to devastating consequences for Indigenous communities. The commodification of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples were reclassified as chattel property driven by European colonial greed. This process stripped them of humanity, reducing them to commodities. Justified by racist ideologies, it enabled egregious exploitation. Chattel slavery, rooted in ancient forced labor, became insidious under colonialism. Indigenous peoples faced brutal conditions, denied rights, and lost their cultures. The transatlantic slave trade also ensnared Indigenous peoples in horrific conditions. Commodification extended beyond physical enslavement. Land seizures, justified by doctrines like the Doctrine of Discovery, commodified territories. Forests were cleared, minerals extracted, and lands converted to agriculture. This commodification devastated Indigenous communities, fracturing families and disrupting lives. The legacy of exploitation continues today, with Indigenous communities facing ongoing struggles. Severed from heritage, the theft of identity and its lasting impacts. The theft of identity, a central element of colonialism, aimed to erase Indigenous cultures, languages, and histories. This brutal process devastated the transmission of knowledge, language, and traditions. Forced removal to boarding schools exemplified this cultural genocide. These institutions aim to strip Indigenous children of their cultures and languages. This systematic erasure created profound cultural alienation and loss. Today, Indigenous communities strive to revitalize their languages and heal from the past. From chattel back to reclaiming your birthrights, reclaiming humanity, restoring rights, the journey from chattel back to birthrights has been a long and arduous one for Indigenous peoples, marked by centuries of struggle, resistance, and resilience. Emerging from the shadow of colonialism and slavery, Indigenous communities have fought tirelessly to reclaim their humanity, to assert their inherent rights, and to secure their rightful place in the world. This process of reclaiming and restoring has involved challenging legal systems that once defined them as property, dismantling racist ideologies that sought to justify their exploitation, and revitalizing cultural traditions and languages that were nearly extinguished by assimilationist policies. The fight for recognition as citizens, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails, has been a central demand of Indigenous movements worldwide. Indigenous peoples have challenged their exclusion from political processes, demanded access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, and fought for the recognition of their treaty rights and land claims. This struggle for recognition has often been met with resistance from governments and powerful interests that benefit from the status quo. However, Indigenous communities have persisted, drawing strength from their ancestors, their cultures, and their unwavering commitment to a better future for their children and grandchildren. The process of reclaiming humanity and restoring rights is not simply about achieving legal equality, it is about healing the deep wounds of the past and creating a world where Indigenous peoples are respected, valued, and fully included in all aspects of society. It is about recognizing the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous nations, respecting their treaty rights, and supporting their self-determination. This journey is far from over, as Indigenous communities continue to face systemic racism, discrimination, and the ongoing system of colonialism. However, the progress that has been made, often in the face of overwhelming odds, is a testament to the power of Indigenous resistance, the importance of allyship, and the unwavering belief in a future where justice, equality, and respect prevail. The theft of Indigenous identity, rooted in colonialism, continues today in subtle and insidious ways. From cultural appropriation to the denial of sovereignty, identity theft shapes the relationship between Indigenous peoples and society. Unveiling these systems of oppression is essential for dismantling structures of injustice. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths and challenging dominant narratives. Appropriation of Indigenous cultures for commercial gain is pervasive. This commodification disrespects Indigenous communities and perpetuates harmful stereotypes. Denial of Indigenous sovereignty is another form of identity theft. Despite international recognition, many Indigenous nations face obstacles in exercising their rights. Confronting identity theft requires education, advocacy, and policy change. It demands listening to Indigenous voices and supporting their initiatives. We must challenge systems of power and create a just society for all. The historical policies and decrees explored in this essay, from the papal bulls and the Doctrine of Discovery, paint a bleak picture of systematic dispossession and cultural suppression. Yet a powerful theme emerges: the remarkable resilience of Indigenous communities. Despite centuries of oppression, Indigenous peoples have never relinquished their claims. They have resisted assimilation and fought tirelessly to protect their sacred sites and languages. This resilience is evident in the ongoing revitalization of Indigenous languages, the resurgence of traditional knowledge systems, and the growing movement for Indigenous self-determination worldwide. Indigenous communities are reclaiming their narratives and asserting their rights. Their resilience is a testament to the enduring power of their cultures and spiritual beliefs. These connections provide strength, identity, and purpose. The unbroken thread of Indigenous resilience serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring human spirit. It is a testament to hope, community, and belief in a better future. We can draw inspiration from the resilience of Indigenous peoples and their commitment to a just world. For far too long, the stories of Indigenous peoples have been told through the lens of colonialism. Their histories distorted, their voices silenced, and their experiences marginalized. The dominant narrative, often shaped by those in power, has presented a skewed and incomplete picture of the past, obscuring the injustices inflicted upon Indigenous communities and perpetuating harmful stereotypes that continue to impact their lives today. Reclaiming the narrative, ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard and that their perspectives are centered in our understanding of history and our vision for the future, is essential for achieving justice, reconciliation, and healing. It requires a fundamental shift in power dynamics, a willingness to listen with open hearts and minds, and a commitment to amplifying Indigenous voices in all their diversity and complexity. Indigenous peoples are the keepers of their own histories, their cultures, and their languages. Their stories, passed down through generations of storytellers, songwriters, and knowledge keepers, offer invaluable insights into the human experience, the interconnectedness of all living things, and the importance of respecting the delicate balance of nature. These stories, often silenced or ignored in mainstream historical accounts, provide a counter-narrative to the dominant discourse, challenging stereotypes, exposing injustices, and offering alternative ways of seeing the world. They remind us that history is not a monolithic entity, but a tapestry of diverse perspectives, experiences, and interpretations. By listening to Indigenous voices, by creating spaces for Indigenous artists, writers, and activists to share their stories, and by incorporating Indigenous perspectives into our education systems, our media, and our policy decisions, we can begin to dismantle the structures of colonialism that have silenced Indigenous voices for far too long. Reclaiming the narrative is not simply about righting past wrongs. It is about creating a future where Indigenous peoples are empowered to tell their own stories, shape their own destinies, and contribute their unique wisdom and perspectives to the world. Confronting the legacy of colonialism requires more than acknowledging past wrongs. It demands action. Dismantling systems of oppression and creating a future of justice and equity is essential. Grounded in reconciliation, reparations, and restorative justice, we address historical harm. Reconciliation involves acknowledging harms, taking responsibility, and building new relationships. Reparations provide tangible redress for material and cultural losses. Restorative justice emphasizes repairing harm and restoring relationships. Creating spaces for dialogue and understanding is crucial. Pursuing these principles creates a better future for all. The historical policies and decrees that have led to the dispossession and marginalization of Indigenous peoples are not merely events of the past. They are ongoing legacies that continue to shape the present and impact the future. Addressing these legacies requires a collective effort, a commitment from individuals, communities, and institutions to challenge injustice, amplify Indigenous voices, and work towards a future where the rights, cultures, and self-determination of Indigenous peoples are respected and protected. This call to action begins with education, with learning about the true history of Indigenous settler relations, understanding the ongoing impacts of colonialism, and challenging the dominant narratives that often perpetuate harmful stereotypes and erase Indigenous experiences. It involves listening to Indigenous voices, seeking out Indigenous perspectives, and supporting Indigenous-led initiatives to revitalize languages, cultures, and traditional knowledge systems. Beyond education, this call to action requires a commitment to advocacy, to using our voices and platforms to speak out against injustice, to support Indigenous-led movements for land rights, self-determination, and cultural revitalization, and to hold governments and institutions accountable for upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples. It also requires a willingness to examine our own roles and responsibilities in perpetuating systems of oppression, to challenge our own biases and assumptions, and to work towards dismantling the structures of colonialism that continue to disadvantage Indigenous communities. Honoring the past, shaping the future is not a passive endeavor. It is an active and ongoing process that demands our attention, our energy, and our commitment. It is a journey that we must undertake together, recognizing that the well-being of Indigenous peoples is inextricably linked to the well-being of all. By working together, by listening to Indigenous voices, by challenging injustice, and by supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, we can create a future where the rights, cultures, and self-determination of Indigenous peoples are respected, protected, and celebrated.